Well, the federal government has released its quarterly update on greenhouse gas inventory, indicating our greenhouse emissions are increasing. Joining me live now is Matt Rose, the economist from the Australian Conservation Foundation. Firstly, Matt, thanks for your company this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Overall emissions have risen by 0.6% over the past year. Obviously, a lot of people would be hoping that those emissions were actually going in the other direction.
Yeah, obviously we have a Paris Agreement to reach. We have a climate crisis that is more obvious now than ever, with things like the Great Barrier Reef Outlook report that came out yesterday that said our reef was in a very poor condition because of climate change. So, yeah, emissions, Australia's emissions are going up when absolutely they need to be going down.
OK, so let's dissect this a little bit. Why are they going up? What sectors are seeing the biggest increases in those emissions? And if any, what sectors are actually decreasing? Any of them doing a good job to work towards that?
So I think I'll start with the good news. So the good news is that our electricity emissions continue to decline because of a move to renewable energy. So we've seen in the last year, we've seen a massive ramp up in solar and a decline in the amount of power and electricity we're getting from gas and coal. Also good news, but for probably the wrong reasons, is that agricultural emissions have fallen because of the drought. So the amount of cattle across the country has dramatically decreased and therefore agricultural emissions are down. The bad news is that, as you said, emissions are up overall, and this is because of things like our transport emissions, which continue to rise. Emissions from LNG processes and other manufacturing processes also continue to increase. So the good, unfortunately, is outweighed by the bad in this case, and our emissions continue to rise.
OK, so the ones that are continuing to increase is transport emissions and also LNG. So what can we do, practically speaking, to try and bring those sectors down, to bring the emissions that they're giving out?
Well, transport is a real opportunity in terms of our fuel efficiency standards, which Australia lags the world in. We have some of the worst fuel efficiency standards in the developed world. And, of course, electric vehicles. The shift to electric vehicles is happening a lot faster throughout the world than it is happening in Australia. And so
just to
investing
in...
Sorry.
What do you mean by fuel efficiency? What particular things does that, to the everyday Australian, what does that mean?
So that's literally the quality of the type of fuel we are putting in our cars. They have higher amounts of sulphur and other things that contributes to pollution. We don't have the same level of standards. So governments across the world require fuel to meet a certain standard. And so Australia has really lax standard for whatever reason. This is where we find ourselves. So improving those standards would really work to improve pollution, especially pollution that affects people in the communities where they are, because lots of us live in big cities in Australia, and cars and transport are a thing we interact with on an almost daily basis. So that would improve that. And then that shift to electric vehicles, which would require either government setting standards or incentives, or improving the infrastructure available for electric vehicles, and especially for freight and for the things that get moved around in Australia between cities by truck. So we can look at electrifying the truck fleet and doing things like that, which means hopefully we use less diesel use, and it also means investing more in rail infrastructure to move freight around, which again would help really reduce those transport emissions. In terms of LNG, the process of LNG requires a lot of electricity, and there's a lot of what's called fugitive emissions, so emissions that are released through the flaring of gas in the process. So LNG, despite the fact that it's being touted as some kind of cleaner fuel, actually has massive ramifications for our greenhouse gas emissions.
OK, so earlier you did mention electricity and the, I guess, attempts that we are making to use more renewables, but it has been something that we've really been struggling with as a nation for the past few years now, with electricity prices so high. How do we balance this? How do we commit to investing more in renewable energy without having to bleed the pockets of everyday Australians?
Well, what I would say is that renewable energy is actually saving people money across the country. I don't buy into the fact that renewable energy is more expensive. It is cheaper to build new renewable energy than it is to build or upgrade current coal-fired power stations. So we need to upgrade our stock of coal-fired power stations regardless of the climate crisis we're in. Now, we need to upgrade them and close them down because of the climate crisis. So they need to be replaced anyway because they're old and because of their climate emissions. Renewable energy is that pathway to providing the investment in new clean infrastructure for the country. And it's a really important step in terms of continuing to drive down our emissions. Electricity and transport are really the low-hanging fruit here in terms of our emissions. So if we can invest more in cleaning those sectors up while we work out how we work through things like agriculture and emissions from manufacturing processes, then we can go a long way to driving down our emissions.
Okay, Matt, final question. It is probably a trickier one, though. Federal Energy Minister Angus Taylor, he insists that we will meet our Paris Agreement targets, which would see a reduction in emissions by 26 to 28% on 2005 levels by 2030. Now, that's through a $3.5 billion plan where companies are paid to reduce their emissions. In your opinion, do we have any hope of meeting that target?
In short, no, not at all. We are emitting about 538.9 million metric tonnes of carbon pollution. We need to be emitting under the Paris Agreement between 435 and 441 million metric tonnes. So we need to reduce our emissions by 100 million tonnes by 2030. And the fact is our emissions have continued to rise. We had a carbon price in place that was reducing emissions and saving people and companies money, and this government removed it. And the Emissions Reduction Fund or the Climate Solutions Fund, however you want to badge it, isn't going to deliver enough carbon reduction with the money that they've provided. The last reverse auction was not very well bid into, and therefore the opportunities that fund's provided, and there have been some around carbon farming, are starting to run out. And the government now needs to look at the major sectors that we've been talking about, like electricity, like manufacturing, like agriculture and like transport. That's where you make the big gains in reducing carbon emissions.
Well, there's certainly plenty of data to analyse there and certainly some food for thought. Thanks so much for your time this morning, Matt Rose from the Australian Conservation Foundation.